Have you ever wondered what the law was really like in the Old West? Imagine a place where justice is as savage as the land itself, where sheriffs and outlaws draw their pistols under the scorching sun, and every dust raised could be the prelude to a deadly duel. Welcome to the world without rules, where right and wrong are decided not only by the law, but by the force of courage and cunning. In this video, we will delve into the depths of the history of the Wild West, uncovering the development of the legal system and the famous criminals who became legends. From duels to grand jury trials, from the influence of cattle barons to the rise of the first sheriffs, each story is a fragment of the mosaic that makes up our understanding of American justice. Prepare yourself for a journey through time, where each topic is a door to the past, revealing not just the facts, but the emotions and conflicts of an era defined by both its heroes and its villains. This is not just a video, it's an experience that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Old West. Old West legal system. In the Old West, despite its reputation as a lawless land, the legal system was far from non-existent. In fact, it was a constantly evolving structure, adapting to the needs of an expanding frontier. When pioneers moved west, they took their legal traditions with them, molding them as situations demanded. Stories of the Old West show how itinerant judges and sheriffs became central figures, facing the challenges of the region's vastness and isolation. The role of these men was vital as the application of the law varied widely from place to place, reflecting the diversity and complexity of life at that time. The more established cities in the Old West were generally able to create more organized judicial systems. However, in more remote areas, justice had to be improvised. This ranged from speedy trials and public condemnations to the simple decision to ignore certain crimes due to lack of resources. The context of territorial expansion and the scarcity of authorities meant that the stories of the Old West were full of adaptations. For example, in a small town, a sheriff might be at once the judge, the enforcer of the law, and the mediator of civil disputes, illustrating the extent to which the law was shaped by circumstances. This reality gave rise to a fascinating duality. On the one hand, there was a genuine search for order. On the other, the chaotic environment of the Old West allowed many laws to be broken or interpreted flexibly. That's where the stories of outlaws come in, figures who took advantage of the gaps and inconsistencies in the system to prosper. This tension between order and chaos is what makes the Wild West such a rich and nuanced period, setting the stage for the rise of outlaws, the subject of the next topic. The rise of the outlaws. With the difficulty in applying the law in such a vast and isolated region, the Old West became fertile ground for the emergence of famous outlaws. Legendary figures like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy emerged not only for the crimes they committed, but for the way their Wild West stories were told and dramatized by the media of the time. These men knew how to exploit the flaws in the legal system and the ineffectiveness of the authorities, carrying out daring robberies that quickly became part of the collective imagination. His audacious actions challenged the established order, fueling the legend that the Old West was a land of opportunity, including for outlaws. The lack of a solid legal structure in many regions of the Old West meant that outlaws acted with a certain freedom, always one step ahead of the authorities. To the populace, these figures often represented a kind of anti-hero, challenging the powerful and perceived injustice at the hands of wealthy cattle barons and other elites. This context created a curious dynamic. While sheriffs fought to impose order, outlaws became popular icons, symbols of resistance and rebellion. The stories of the Old West, full of adventures and confrontations, reinforced this almost mythical image of criminals. However, it is important to understand that these outlaws were not just common bandits, but also products of a system in transition. Old West society was constantly changing, and failures in law enforcement paved the way for these individuals to dare to challenge established norms. Outlaws took advantage of this era of uncertainty, marking the Wild West with their exploits, but at the same time, paving the way for the evolution of the legal system. And so, as pressure mounts on sheriffs and law enforcement, their role becomes the next point of analysis. The role of sheriffs and deputies. In the Old West, the sheriff was more than just a guardian of the law. He was the very incarnation of order in a land of challenge and uncertainty. Elected by the community, the sheriff had the difficult mission of keeping the peace and ensuring that the stories of the Old West were not just chaos and disorder. In many localities, he was the only legal figure within hundreds of miles, responsible for everything from investigating crimes to resolving civil disputes. Their presence symbolized both the authority and the fragility of the legal system in a region where the law was a concept in constant construction. The deputies, often chosen by the sheriff himself, were his right-hand men in law enforcement. Together, they formed the fine line between order and chaos, facing not only outlaws, but also the limitations imposed by geographic vastness and scarcity of resources. Old West stories are full of moments when sheriffs had to make quick decisions, often facing armed gangs with few men at their side. The courage of these men, facing outlaws and defying the odds, was what held communities together and, in many cases, prevented the Wild West from descending completely into chaos. However, the role of the sheriff was not without dilemmas. The line between justice and survival was thin, and in some situations, the sheriff had to make concessions to keep the peace. If a dangerous outsider arrived in town, for example, the sheriff could decide to negotiate or even allow his escape, as long as this guaranteed the safety of the citizens. This complexity, which permeates the stories of the Old West, reflects how difficult it was to be a representative of the law during that period. And where formal law could not reach, citizens themselves often took justice into their own hands, which brings us to the next topic about trials and vigilante justice. Trials and surveillance justice. In the Old West, when the law failed or was non-existent, citizens often took it upon themselves to ensure order, giving rise to vigilante justice. In many small towns, where the presence of a sheriff or judge was rare, vigilance committees emerged as a temporary but not always fair solution. The stories of the Old West are full of cases in which these groups made quick and often brutal decisions, hanging suspects without a proper trial. Although the intention was to maintain peace, the result could be chaotic, with abuses and injustices committed in the name of order. These vigilante committees reflected the constant tension between the need to enforce the law and the lack of a consolidated legal framework. It was a time when citizens were forced to act, often driven by desperation or fear, and the Wild West did not offer many alternatives. The legend that justice was faster and more efficient in the hands of the people became part of the stories of the Old West, but it also left a legacy of violence and distrust. A classic example was the famous lynching of Tom Horn, a gunman accused of murder in Wyoming, where mob justice prevailed over due process. The actions of these vigilantes also highlighted the weaknesses and gaps in the legal system of the Old West. Where formal law could not reach, these citizens became judges, jurors, and executioners, creating justice outside established norms. However, as the legal system evolved and communications improved, the need for vigilante justice was replaced by more formal structures. This changing environment brought to light the influence of cattle magnates, who often used their wealth to shape law enforcement to their interests, which brings us to the next topic. The influence of the cattle magnates. In the Old West, cattle magnates were more than just ranchers, they were true barons who wielded enormous influence over law enforcement. With vast tracts of land and considerable resources at their disposal, these powerful men could hire private security guards and even bribe local officials to ensure their interests were protected. Stories of the Old West often show these barons in conflict with small landowners and settlers who saw their lands and rights threatened by these cattle giants. This concentrated power transformed the law into a tool in the hands of the richest, creating a scenario of inequality and tension. The presence of these magnates profoundly shaped the social and economic dynamics of the Old West. In many regions, the word of a cattle baron was worth more than that of a sheriff or judge. It was common for these powerful individuals to dictate the rules and, in some cases, even influence the formation of private militias to resolve disputes in their own way. Stories of the Old West reveal how the law often bent to the will of these tycoons, who used their position to crush competition and secure their dominance over vast territories. An example of this is the famous Range War in New Mexico, where the struggle for control of rangelands led to bloody conflicts. However, this influence of the magnates was not undeniable. Small landowners, over time, began to organize themselves and resist the attacks of the big barons. The stories of the Old West, full of confrontations and battles, also reflect this fight for justice and balance. As the Wild West developed and the law began to solidify, the power of the cattle magnates encountered more and more opposition. This evolution of the legal system opened space for the participation of other groups in the application of justice, including women, whose roles on the border were as diverse as they were essential. Women and the law. In the Old West, women played surprisingly varied and often decisive roles in law enforcement and community formation. Although limited by the social norms of the time, some stood out both inside and outside the legality. Stories of the Old West reveal female figures who, on the one hand, worked hard to establish order and, on the other, defied the rules by engaging in criminal activities. These women, although fewer in number, left an indelible mark on the history of the frontier, whether by helping to build more just societies or joining the outlaws. Within communities, women often took on the role of mediators, ensuring that justice was applied in a balanced manner. In many stories from the Old West, we find matriarchs who, despite adversity, stood up as pillars of their cities, directly influencing local decisions. They organized committees, contributed to the construction of churches and schools, and, in some cases, even served as judges in makeshift courts. Their sense of justice and dedication to collective well-being were essential to establishing a legal system that reflected the community's values, even in such a hostile environment. On the other hand, the Wild West was also a setting for women who followed the opposite path, embracing life outside the law. Names like Belle Starr have become legendary for defying expectations and living by their own rules. These female figures helped shape the popular imagination of the Old West, proving that law and disorder were not exclusively male domains. As the federal presence increased and communications improved, the era of outlaws, both men and women, began to decline, setting the stage for the next topic, which addresses the end of this iconic era. The end of the outlaw era. As time passed, the outlaw era of the Old West began to decline, driven by improved communications and an increased federal presence. The introduction of the telegraph and the expansion of railways made it more difficult for these criminals to evade authorities, marking the beginning of the end of their daring activities. Furthermore, the creation of agencies such as the FBI and the implementation of stricter federal laws brought a new level of organization and effectiveness to law enforcement, reducing the room for maneuver for outlaws. Stories of the Old West, once marked by spectacular escapes and daring heists, began to change tone. The capture of notorious criminals such as Jesse James and Billy the Kid symbolized this transition from a wild frontier to a more regulated society. The Wild West, which once seemed a land of opportunity for outlaws, became increasingly hostile to those who defied the law. Stories of the Old West revealed that as the federal government consolidated its control over the region, the legal loopholes that allowed outlaws to flourish were gradually closed. This process, although slow, brought a new era of order and predictability, where the risk of facing justice became increasingly greater. However, even with the decline of the outlaw era, the legacy of these characters continued to fascinate the popular imagination. And so, buddy, we conclude another journey through the fascinating stories of the Old West. If you enjoyed these adventures filled with bravery, mystery, and legends, don't forget to leave your like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any chapter of this epic saga.